Thank you all for coming. My name is Richard Newfarmer. I'm the country director for 3 countries in Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, and South Sudan for the International Growth Center. I'm pleased to say that the International Growth Center is a small contributor to this conference, in part because it's a personal interest of mine and one that I think is increasing importance to the International Growth Center. While we're studying things like urbanization in cities, energy, we also focus on state capabilities, one of which, of course, is the management of trade and investment policy. And the second is firms, firm capability. And here the literature that we're looking at recently on the role of firms in trade, I think, is increasingly important. One of the reasons why I'm giving you such a long introduction is to get the people in the back to sit down. And of course, the more they do it, the quicker they do that, the shorter will be my introduction. In any case, we're delighted to have to be discussing today the prospects for further trade integration, lessons from Brexit, TTIP, and the WTO. And I'm really hopeful that we'll get the answer, at least in part, to 3 quandaries that I have in looking at the global situation. One is this funny situation in the United States where we have 2 candidates running for office, one who is a protectionist and the other who is even more protectionist. Of course, protectionist in a globalization sense, because not only focusing on trade policy, but particularly immigration policy. On the one hand, but on the other hand, in the United States, if you do look at the surveys generally support U.S. efforts to have global trade agreements. They're generally supportive of the regional agreements the U.S. has signed as well. So that's one quandary, what's happening in the leadership and the political dimension, and what the people at large think. Where is the disconnect there? The second disconnect has to do with what's happening in the North versus what's happening in the South. On the one hand, you have what I'll call the forces of dissolution. On the one hand, Brexit. On the other hand, as part of that, maybe the skepticism about the mega regional agreements that we have, versus what's happening in countries that I'm working on in Africa, where you see a tremendous incentive and push towards greater regional integration. It takes the form not only of deepening integration, such as the East African Community, or in ECOWAS, the West Africa Agreement, but also in trying to establish larger trade agreements, the Tripartite Agreement, the Continental Free Trade Agreement. So there's this sort of disconnect between what's happening in the North and what's happening in the South. And perhaps the panel can shed some light on that question. And the final perplexing quandary I have is the notion that people are concerned, on the one hand, about the implications of trade and trade policy. But on the other hand, austerity seems to dominate, at least in the United States, the whole discussion over the safety net that would help facilitate the response to globalization and help increase support to the growth dynamics that globalization would otherwise provide. So there's 3 quandaries that, and I've talked long enough to get everybody seated, so we can now introduce this panel. It's a terrific panel, I have to say. Thomas Cottier from the WTI, Thomas Bollyky, did I get that right? From the Council on Foreign Relations, Werner, the ambassador to the WTO from Germany, and then finally Marc Vanheukelen, the ambassador from the EU to the WTO. Forgive me for mispronouncing virtually everybody's name. The only word in Dutch I know is Hoekman, so I'm pleased to welcome this panel. So why don't we start in order, and Thomas, if you'd just provide us with a few opening remarks for what I hope will be a discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Chair. First, let me thank Joe and Werner for inviting me here on this panel. I'm touched. I'm very happy to see the World Trade Forum, which started off as a rather small workshops, to develop into such a wonderful conference in these halls of fame. I just would like to make 3 points to start with. The first one is on communication. We talk about free trade agreements. This term comes from the time when tariffs were 40% on average and had to be cut, and they were cut down to 4%. We continue to talk about free trade in the age of non-tariff barriers and behind the border issues. The question I would like to put to you, is the term still appropriate? Is it reflecting what in fact we are doing? People perceive free trade, informed by what happened in the financial crisis, by a neoliberal approach to deregulation, dismantling regulation, leaving things to markets. So they're afraid that when we have a free trade agreement, we have to import chloride chickens. And the whole debate goes on this, because people perceive they're dismantling regulations. In fact, this is not what we're doing. We are harmonizing regulations. We are trying to introduce mutual rapprochements and equivalence. This is completely different. This is not expressed in the term free trade. So my first point is we have to review our vocabulary. I think we should, in public communications, try to find a term which better reflects what actually is going on. For example, we might use just trade agreements, or we might use the term of trade cooperation agreement, or we might even use the term of trade facilitation, taking it out from the North-South dimension. This is what we're trying to do. My point is, if we would do this, people would be less afraid, and we would have less difficulties to explain what actually is going on, and people, moreover, would actually start to think about the issues which nobody talks about. One of my fields is intellectual property. I know what's going on in TPP on patents in pharmaceuticals. Nobody talks about the cost this may have on our health systems. They rather stay with chloride chickens here. So we really need to rephrase the debate and use a vocabulary that can capture what's going on in modern trade agreements, and I'm really curious what you think. I do think that a lot of the misunderstandings which are out there are partly due to this continued use of the term free trade and free trade agreements, which I think is misleading. My second point and the lessons I was asked to learn from Brexit is we can no longer afford to leave out the trickling down question. We were working under the assumption that trade, international trade, creates welfare effects, and these welfare effects then have to be translated, distributed in nations, and that's done with accordance of national sovereignty and national political systems, etc. I think Brexit has shown us that, and other signs too, the populist movement against trade regulation, is that leaving this question out of the equation on the international level poses a serious threat of international security and destabilization. And I think it's really one of the big questions to economists and lawyers alike. How can we factor in the trickling down question on the international level and not simply leave it to distributive justice? We are still at the very infant stage on distributive justice in international law. Perhaps the Sustainable Development Principles of 2030 in the agenda may start introducing tiny elements into this equation, but we have to think very hard on this, particularly in the WTO, because in the WTO, and this is what I think will be the future, it's not about market access. This is largely done with preferential trade agreements. It will be largely on the issue of subsidies across the board, in agriculture, in services, in aviation, in fisheries. How far should we go? Where is the distribution effect of subsidies? Is it simply the mantra, reduce subsidies, subsidies are bad, or is there an equilibrium? What do we need to achieve? I think it's a matter of creating awareness that this has a lot to do with distribution, distributive justice, and we need to frame it. We need to conceptualize this in order to find appropriate answers here. My third point, and since we're at the European Institute here, relates to the European Union. As you know, the European Union operates on a bifurcated model in foreign policy. although there is an exclusive competence in trade and commerce, most of the agreements turn out to be concluded as mixed agreements, because you always have something new which is not formally covered by exclusive powers here. And we can now see what happens with this model, which was working reasonably well, and in the modern times of behind-the-border issues. Since behind-the-border issues are inherently domestic policy questions, obviously opposition is starting while you negotiate. There is an external front, there is a domestic front, and that's been a feature of the European Union for ages, and I never envied the people who had to deal with this. And I don't know whether the domestic front was more difficult or the external front here, but they had to deal with this at the very same time. So what I would think is necessary is not to say we should get away from mixed agreements, because you will never get this done here to an exclusive foreign policy power in the European Union, but I think we should try to find ways and means how we can front load the foreign policy formulation in trade. How can we generate that these debates, which are now taking place in Germany, in Austria, in France, in the TTIP concept, that they take place before you start the exercise, that there is a foreign policy clearance inside the European Union before you go outside and engage here. And my idea here I'd like to put on the table is to work towards a trade act, that we would, in the form of regulations under 207(4), we would actually develop a regulation dealing with the objectives, the goals, and the principles of trade. And in that act, you would deal with the issues of labor standards, environmental standards, whether you want them, private standards, whether you want to address them or not. I think the EU is like the US in a position to define the agendas in the General Act, and then you may go to a second stage, having more precise directives for negotiations to engage with other countries. If you look at the directives of negotiation these days, they're utterly general. They don't really go to the heart of the matter, with a few exceptions. And so all the opposition is coming up later on, rather than actually front load the debate. And so I would suggest that we think along the line of a trade act as we have it in the United States. It's not something we can copy-paste, it's completely different, but the idea of actually defining objectives and goals, and then also in the end of the day to have some sort of a fast track or a package deal approach to implementation could actually reinforce the negotiating and the treaty-making power of the European Union. So these were my three remarks. Review the communication strategy and the terminologies we're using in this age of behind-the-border issues. Secondly, we need to tackle the trickling down problem. And thirdly, we need to look into trade policy formulation. I took the EU, maybe other countries have the same need to look into their own procedures, and that's how I would propose to entertain the discussion in this panel from my side. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Thomas. Can I turn now to Thomas Bollyky?
Thank you so much. First, I want to thank the organizers for having me at this great venue and having me as part of this panel. I was asked to speak on the U.S. perspective on the implications that Brexit has for trade integration. I'm going to do that from a perspective as a former U.S. trade negotiator and as a man on the street, so to speak, of the U.S. policy and trade community in the U.S. And I think it's fair to say from a U.S. perspective, Brexit was greeted with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. I'm going to talk about the reasons for that concern, which are what Brexit represents for the changing strategic, economic, and political environment for trade liberalization and integration. Another area of concern is what this means for the TTIP. Then I'll talk about the source of uncertainty, which is what does this mean moving forward for the US and UK bilaterally on trade liberalization. And while I have you all prisoner to listening to me on the mic, I will use the opportunity to talk a little bit more about why I think some of the debate emerging from this in the US has perhaps not focused on the right things. And I'll talk a little bit about how that might move forward. All right, so first the concerns on the strategic, economic, and political context. On the strategic side, from a US perspective, a cornerstone of US trade policy, US foreign policy, is a large, open, strong European market as an anchor in the West. The potential diminishment of that is an impediment to trade integration and liberalization, not just at the WTO, but in all the other multilateral fora where trade tends to arise. A weaker EU or a more inwardly facing EU is a bad thing from a US perspective, and certainly that is true for the United Kingdom as well, particularly if there's a potential dissolution of that country in some form. On the economic side, obviously the fact that nobody knows what will follow the vote leads to uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to a drag on investment, potentially in some areas, particularly financial services, potentially divestment. That limits growth, which limits demand. Obviously, you also have a currency part of the story where this tends to make a stronger dollar. All of this, people in the United States used to think didn't have a huge economic impact because we weren't very trade exposed. A relatively small percentage of our economy is trade exposed. I think since last year, with what happened with China, I don't think people think that anymore. So I do think it will have an economic impact, and a weaker economic climate is bad for trade liberalization. That's true everywhere. That's certainly true in the United States. Political context. I don't think the US voters, whether it's in the presidential election or in any of the congressional elections going on, even know Brexit happened by and large. It is doubtful it will have any direct impact on the US vote from that perspective. The people who have paid attention, US politicians. And for US politicians who believe in trade liberalization and economic integration, it's a cautionary tale. For US politicians who see a potential advantage in running against trade liberalization or economic integration, it's emboldening. And we've clearly seen that with at least one of our presidential candidates. Okay, second area of concern. What does this mean for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP? Again, it's a bad thing. The removal from the United Kingdom from the EU would mean a smaller market for US goods. People estimate a 16% smaller market for US goods, but in some sectors it's likely to be more significant. My former colleagues are doing that analysis now, but for instance, 46% of US wine imports, or exports rather, go to the UK. These are how you build constituencies for trade agreements. If you see other sectoral areas that tend to, the potential economic benefits have been lessened, that will lessen some of the support around TTIP. Doesn't mean it doesn't go forward, just makes it harder to pass. The UK was perceived as closer to the US perspective on sanitary and phytosanitary issues and some of the new generation or next generation trade topics that were meant to be taken up in the TTIP. So from that perspective, to the extent that the TTIP was meant to set a model for what trade agreements might look for, or at least be a bridge to a new model for what trade agreements might look for, it's seen from US perspective as a bad thing that the UK may not be part of those negotiations. All right, so what does this mean for the US and the UK bilaterally? I will say if the US were willing to do a simple bilateral trade agreement with anyone, it would be the United Kingdom. I think as a general matter, we've moved away from that. It's inefficient, but if it were ever to do one, it certainly would be with the United Kingdom. Much has been made of President Obama's statement that the United Kingdom would be at the back of the queue. It is not a formulation I endorse merely because queue implies forward movement. Or the potential for forward movement. I currently, in terms of U.S. trade policy, it's more like they may be one of a number of parties in a waiting room for that to occur. I do think it eats up bandwidth, the potential to do a negotiation. People have raised that from the standpoint of negotiators. My experience on the U.S. side, the limiting reagent really on moving deals forward is political. And in terms of eating up bandwidth in Congress and in the White House, I really think that's what would slow this down. I'm not going to predict what form Brexit takes place from a trade perspective. I have no idea if the United Kingdom will remain part of the European Economic Area. I don't have any idea whether it will remain part of the customs union. I don't know if they'll be seeking to negotiate an FTA with the EU. I don't know exactly what will happen in the WTO, how they will do their schedule of commitments. What I do know is that from a US perspective, all of that needs to happen and be decided before you can even move forward with a trade discussion. More time. The Peterson Institute recently did a study on how long it takes to have a U.S. trade agreement negotiated and implemented. Not my favorite study because I think a lot of the work happens before the negotiations were launched. But just as a number to throw out there, the average that was put out there is now 61 months, so a little over 5 years. That has trended upwards over time, so that gives you a sense. I know a lot of people say, well, the United Kingdom is very like-minded with the US, and this could potentially move faster. Well, I remember when everybody said that about TTIP too, and all I can say is that that is a very large single tank of gas. The fuel efficiency on there is a model if we are still moving there. So I am less hopeful that the like-mindedness alone will significantly expedite this. So what do I think this means moving forward? I think too much of the response to Brexit and too much of the response to the concerns about how trade has been framed in elections has focused on whether trade is actually at fault for the trends driving there. I think it is the wrong conversation to have about whether it's globalization or technology. I think a more productive role is, for these trade conversations, is what changes can we make to trade agreements to actually help on those problems? We spend far too much time debating whether we're to blame for this happening, and I think that misses the point. I think there are certainly models that people are looking out there, but I do think it certainly needs to be a model out there that has broader base gains than the very multinational focus that we currently had, at least on the U.S. trade agreement side. Let me pause there.
So Thomas, you didn't answer one key question. Will TPP get approved during the lame duck?
So having been around this for a lot of times, I would never say never because it always looks bleak, frankly, on trade votes. I would put it, if Donald Trump loses significantly, I think it greatly increases the chance of it moving forward. Where I would put that at now, baking that calculation in, is I would say somewhere between about a 33% chance of actually getting passed. I will say if it doesn't get passed now, it's going to be a while before this goes, and that of course moves everything else further down.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was very kind. It's a very nice setting, and I'm impressed and you have a wide audience here. So it seems to be very promising to speak here. I am speaking on my own behalf, and I will try to stay away from politics. So I will be rather general. As a German, we are, of course, fond of all the big principles. So we love the multilateral trading system. It's open, everybody has a voice there, everybody has an equitable chance. So this is what we aim at. And then are the plurilaterals and the bilateral agreements. And Professor Bhagwati, he invented the nice picture of the spaghetti bowl. And spaghettis, they are somehow glibbery, they sometimes slimy, and nobody really likes them. But as we are here in Italy, I like them, I love spaghetti. Why is that so? It's very simple. Already in the history of the GATT, you find mentioning the regional trade agreements. You find notes that regional trade agreements are favoring trade. You find that as well in the GATTs and in other trade agreements. Also, even in the Marrakesh Agreement, you have the famous Annex 4 with the plurilateral trade agreements. So why should we complain about them? They are a reality, they are there, and we should enjoy them. We should make use of them. The reason why we have all these agreements is manifold. So we have specifically the European countries, we have some 40 trade agreements, mostly with neighboring countries. That's a reflection of our neighborhood policy. So why should we abolish them? Then we have a lot of countries which need development assistance, and we have many trade agreements dealing with development policy. So there is no need to abolish them. We need those agreements. And then, of course, we come to something which you call nowadays the mega trade agreements, which are more or less a reflection because WTO did not deliver. We discussed a long time in WTO, and after some time everybody said, well, probably it's too difficult to do that on a multilateral level. Try it on a regional or plurilateral level. It creates more flexibility. You can have different approaches. And you may have two layers of rules. You have one multilateral layer, and one step further down, you have a plurilateral layer, and both help and are in favor of trade. However, it's not that we will stay with these plurilaterals and bilateral trade agreements forever, because the mega regionals and the plurilaterals, they are more or less stepping stones in our intention. We can use them as stepping stones, and after a period of having experienced them, we can come back to the multilateral arena and try to build on that and come to a final multilateral trade agreement. Same is with the plurilaterals and multilaterals. You can use them as test laboratories for new ideas. So you integrate some aspects in there, so you integrate and try to discuss on precautionary principle, on public services, you discuss on specific investor-state dispute settlement, you can discuss on workers' rights, it can be more open to discuss on sustainable development, and later on, after that has been shown to be useful, you come back with those ideas to the multilateral arena. Best argument for the multilateral approach is, of course, the laziness of people and companies, because they don't like to work with complex legal situations. Why should the legal situation be different if you export something to South America compared to North America or compared to Africa or Asia? So what we should aim at is a world with one multilateral trading system. And I have found historical evidence. Historical evidence is the Tokyo round, where we had many multilateral agreements, and later on, during the Uruguay round, we have been successful by multilateralizing them. So, for the time being, I can just say we are in the midst of the spaghettis, but the meat is to come. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. And let me turn finally to Marc, Ambassador Vanheukelen.
Thank you, Chair. I've reflected on this title, Prospects for Further Trade Integration, Lessons from Brexit, TTIP and the WTO, which is not an easy title, but I'll try to give it meaning. Let me do them one after the other. But of course, to ask yourself the question what sort of lessons to draw, you have to get into the question of what has driven the people to vote 52 against 48. What is driving, what has been driving the people who want to kill CETA or TTIP. But on Brexit, I think there are not many things to learn for further trade integration, because most of the people who were in favor of the UK leaving the EU, notably the Conservative Party and UKIP, they're all free traders. I think the lesson is, in particular, or the lesson you can draw that is of relevance for the bigger debate, is that you've got to watch out for immigration, and in particular too rapid immigration, be it permanent or be it temporary, namely Mode 4. I think that has struck a raw nerve, and in many heartlands of labor that turned so massively against the EU, presumably immigration was a big thing. So we have to take that into account. However, of course, for most trade integration negotiations, immigration is not at all on the cards. TTIP. Of course, only future historians and sociologists will really know, if they ever will know, what drives people to be against CETA or TTIP. Looking at the media reports and having spoken to quite a number of the opponents, I think there are 3 or 4 big strands, and often they do not fully overlap. One is the strand of job insecurity and rising income inequality. Although in Europe this question of rising income inequality poses itself much less strongly than in the US and the UK. The rising income inequality is first and foremost an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, much less on the continent. Second, the idea that trade is going to lower labor standards, environmental standards, public health standards, public services standards. Put in a TTIP context, it is the European model of society that is threatened by the US juggernaut. And the third strand that you sometimes have in TTIP is in a way not fully related to trade. It is more against, or it is about lack of transparency, lack of democracy, against the establishment, against the system. Many of the people you see in TTIP, you also see in the marches on disarmament, on the marches against nuclear. This is a broader strand. And of course, trade cannot address that question. What is the lesson from recent developments in the WTO? My own experience, as well as what I have gleaned from reading a lot about it, is that the striking phenomenon in the WTO over the last 10 years is the hollowing out of the common denominator. The rounds until Doha were in a way done by the Quad. The US, EU, Canada, Japan, and then the rest in a way got a free ride. Since then, that's no longer possible. We have other players, China, India, and Brazil in particular. And they have a view that is not very overlapping with ours. And given the fact that there is no common denominator, there is not much going on. We've had two modest successes, one in Bali and one in Nairobi, but clearly those are not the answers to the big challenges for world economic or world trade governance. And right now, and I'm not going to mention any names because that would not be proper for my job, there are among the big hitters, because let's be clear, the WTO has 164 members, but there are only actually 5 or 7 that matter. Among those, there are 2 who are perfectly happy with the status quo. Perfectly happy. And given that you need unanimity, you have a problem. Now, what do I, on the basis of these sort of lessons that I've drawn, what are the sort of takeaways that I have in terms of, say, prospects for further trade integration? I think I mentioned 4 and then I stopped there. Indeed, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, you should pay much more attention to the social divide than currently is the case. There are lots of people who are anxious and angry, and that has a lot to do with that. What you need for that, to my mind, is a good social security system, good vocational training, very low taxes on low wages, in order to make sure that these unskilled or the semi-skilled can still stay in the labor market. I don't think that the salvation will come from specific instruments, like the trade adjustment assistance or what we have in the European Union, European Globalization Fund. That's all nice and well, but it doesn't do the trick. It doesn't do the trick. The only thing that works is a decent social security system, plus vocational training. 2, explain better the gains, but also the consequences of trade integration. Frankly, I think that we are trying as hard as we can to do that. In the European Commission, when we start an FTA, and most people should recall that, we first do a study, a scoping study. Then we do an impact assessment. Then we ask for a mandate from the Council. We have a debate in the European Parliament. Once we have started the negotiations, we do a sustainability impact assessment. And when that is done, we bring it to the Council and to Parliament for ratification. Now, these are all moments of discussion. We have every 3 months in the European Commission a discussion with civil society on trade policy. Perhaps we can do much better, but I honestly think that we now don't know anymore what to do. You cannot undress a naked person, right? We've done, we believe, basically everything we could. Some people say, well, you're not transparent enough, you should give your trade negotiation positions and put them in the public domain. I mean, that's madness. That's madness. There's not a single party, not even the Green Party, that does that. If you go into a government coalition negotiation, not a single party says, here are my negotiating tactics. But I have the impression that some people want that. But I agree, we need to work more on communication, but it's not easy, often in what is now termed the post-factual society. Facts don't matter, words do. Experts are seen as very suspicious. And it's not easy to work on that. 3, it has already been said this morning, enforce existing rules better. I'm not a great fan of trade defense instruments, but right now I understand that we need to use them, and extensively. I was just in a meeting and there people said, we see a rise in protectionism. Well, most people see the use of trade defense instruments not as a rise of protectionism. They see this as dealing with unfair trade in sectors that are suffering chronically from overcapacity. And then, given that we're flying through heavy weather, I guess the only thing you can do is be pragmatic and go slow. I hope we can preserve the base camp. The base camp is called CETA. If we cannot get CETA through, I think you can easily forget about European trade policy for the next 20 years. Now, some people want precisely that. Huh? Some people want precisely that. But if you still believe in European trade policy, then CETA is an absolute must. To probably press the pause button on TTIP for 6 months, 1 year, because, well, TTIP has now become a poisoned chalice. Some people have used TTIP to blacken it so as to whiten CETA. I'm not certain that was very clever, but that is what has happened. But I think, TTIP has to be put in the fridge, and let's see when we take that out. And as far as the WTO is concerned, and the run-up to MC11, I guess that the only thing we can try is pragmatic, fairly small steps, but valuable steps in domains that are close to getting consensus that we need to do something. I think there are 2 files that come to mind, because on all the other, I immediately see the blockages from one or the other. Fishery subsidies is one. It used to be a subject that had no traction. Now, basically everyone says fishery subsidies. Even China, the biggest culprit, is saying, yeah, we should do something on fishery subsidies. And 2, much overdue, is see whether you need WTO rules to expedite e-commerce. Those are the 2 areas where I see scope for results, and I think that is then, given the current adverse climate on trade, that is what we should invest in. There are lots of other subjects that are much more important, that cry for a solution, but it's just not on the cards. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if there is one unifying theme coming out of this panel, and maybe this morning's plenary as well, it's the challenge to this audience to explain why trade is good for growth, good for raising incomes, including low incomes. That's the challenge I hear coming out, whether we call it communication or packaging or fast track, whatever it is a need for greater transparency and discussion in such a way that people in the political community, in the larger community voting, know what trade does for them. In any case, with that, can we open the discussion to the audience and take some questions and comments? Let me start in the back. Gentleman back there. Yeah, please. Can I just ask everybody to state their name for those of us who live in Washington and are not
I think Brexit was caused by non-economic reasons, as one of the speakers rightly explained. I think the current opposition of civil society against CETA and TTIP is, like, as Ambassador Vanheukelen rightly explained, again, based on non-economic reasons. So we should recognize that I think this opposition we cannot respond to this opposition by explaining the economic benefits of free trade only. I mean, that is, of course, I think most people understand it. Again, the 2 speakers said, I mean, even though people voted for Brexit, they support free trade. So I think the reply given by Ambassador Vanheukelen is basically wrong. I think if you say we don't know what to do in order to convince citizens, in order to convince civil society, the answer is read the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty says, the Lisbon Treaty says the EU policy must focus on the citizen, must place the citizen at the center of the policy. Article 1 says decisions must be taken as transparently, as closely as possible to the citizen. You must embrace the citizen. You must empower the citizen. And then the citizens will engage in an inclusive dialogue. And I think there are lots of very good reasons to persuade citizens, but you have to Yeah, but I mentioned this Article 30.6 of the CETA agreement, which says citizens have no rights under this FTA. No citizen can invoke this FTA in domestic courts. Only the powerful players, foreign investors, have access to investment arbitration. This is a feudalist approach where you say, citizens trust me, but you don't have any rights. And that is the approach we know from European integration, which has never worked in European integration. European integration has been a bottom-up process, not a top-down process. And you must rethink your top-down process in trade policy. That is simply no longer accepted by civil society. And when we saw that you engaged in a public consultation, 95% of the citizens reacted, no, the investment rules are bad. And then all of a sudden,
Thanks very much. Let's take one more comment. Carlos Braga had his hand up, and then we'll come back to the panel and hopefully then have an opportunity for a second round of comments. If the commenters and questioners keep their comments short, Dr. Braga.
Carlos Primo Braga, Fundação Dom Cabral, Brasil. Thomas both made a very interesting proposition that if Mr. Trump is defeated by a big margin, you believe that the chances of ratifying TPP, if I understood correctly, during the lame duck period of the Congress increased significantly. Would you be willing to bet what margin would make this magic possible? Because right now, I would argue that your 33% is optimism. Now a question to Marc. Very interesting. I don't know if I fully understood when you said that the people who voted in favor of Brexit are really in favor of freer trade in general. Is that what you meant? Yeah. Well, I would be very interested in seeing this correlation. And of course, correlations are a little bit like asking, married people are happier than single people? And the answer is yes, but are they happier because they are happy and then they were able to get married, or because they are married? And I have to say, I have never seen this proposition. The best explanatory variable for Brexit consistently in our studies has been level of education. So the lower the level of education, more pro-Brexit vote. And it was not even, if you look at the counties in the UK, it's not by the level of immigration, it's the change in the level of immigration. So it is an interesting new data that you bring to the fore. And just to finalize, you said the problem with the WTO is that you hollow out the consensus among, let's say, the Quad in the past with the new players today. And then I immediately jumped to the conclusion that TTIP would be much easier than to continue negotiations at multilateral level at this point in time. But then you basically said we have to put TTIP in the fridge. So basically what you are saying is that nothing is going to happen in trade in the coming months unless Mr. Trump is elected. Then lots of things are going to happen.
Thanks. Before we take a second round of comments, let's just have a quick response to the panel. If there's anything that prodded your interest, not everybody has to respond. And if you want, just I'd prefer if you keep your comments very short.
Okay. Just very quickly, on the first point, the reason why, there are a couple of reasons why I think explaining the past is not helpful. One, I think there's much debate about the evidence of the past. I mean, the authors of that China PNTR study, for instance, are supportive of the TPP and the trade agreements that follow. China deciding to have an economy after artificially suppressing their chances of having it before is not convincing, to me at least, that this is a fault of trade. The White House's Council and Economic Advisor in this administration put out a report glowing about the gains of NAFTA. The point is, it doesn't matter anymore. The reason why it doesn't matter is people have formed an opinion, you're not going to convince them through explaining. More importantly, in the US context, both parties have come out and said these were bad. Whether they were right, they were bad anymore, doesn't matter. Once you had 2 elections in a row with President Obama running on NAFTA being a bad thing, and now this election with both candidates running on NAFTA being a bad thing, putting evidence forward how actually it wasn't really a bad thing is not going to help. So I just think it's a waste of time. What's a better time is to say there are real problems in our society, and we shouldn't solve them all through enforcement. We shouldn't solve them all through domestic support programs, even though both of those should be part of the calculation. Trade needs to play a positive role in spreading the benefits of globalization in people's lives, and here are the ideas how to do that. And that's what I'd really say moving forward. On the Trump side, I think the margin he has to lose by is people need to be convinced that he lost by a sufficient margin that it's not just because of his rhetoric and the overt racism it displays that he lost, but because the underlying philosophy on which he has run is not a winning strategy for future candidates. That's the margin he has to lose by. I can't tell you what number that is, but it has to be perceived. It's not just the presentation of those ideas that got him lost, it's the ideas themselves.
If I can just jump in on that real quickly. I think one of the issues that is driving the Trump campaign is the link between immigration and trade policy, right? We have to remember when he came down the escalator to announce his candidacy, the big thing he talked about was building a wall with Mexico. That got morphed into a discussion of trade policy. Why was that? Because Ohio is extremely important. He has to win Ohio. He knows that's where trade policy can merge. But to your point, if he loses, one issue that is going to drive a wedge between immigration policy on the one hand and trade policy on the other is the Hispanic vote in the United States. And there, Hispanics, if they come out in force against him, I think will drive a very useful wedge between this anti-immigration, ultimately racist campaign that he's running and trade policy, and that would be a salutary thing. Sorry, end of parentheses. Thomas, you have some point.
I just wanted to take up Udi's statement that the reasons in Brexit were non-economic, and I would doubt this. If you look at the Midlands and you square the patterns of voting with the decline of these regions in terms of industrial employment, etc. If you look at the present state of the Labour Party, you can see that there is an economic issue, and I think I would very much endorse what Marc said. If you want to have trade integration, you have to accompany this with a safety net. And we have this very odd situation that in the root political debate, people are either in favor of free trade and they're against social policy. They think that's socialist, and the socialists are against free trade, and that's just stupid. I mean, you can see that countries who are successful, they have both, and my question is, how can international trade law support this? What do we need to do in order to allow countries, and what are the policy spaces we need to have in order to allow countries to go down that way? And I don't think we're there at the moment because we still live from that split. I also would like to, in terms of the challenges we have in the WTO, I think one of the most important things is that we have to look where are the unique selling points of the WTO these days. And none of these preferential trade agreements take up on subsidies. None. Agricultural subsidies, no, because the spillover effect is too large. So we should focus on these. Secondly, none on the panel has mentioned climate change. Climate change adaptation, mitigation will essentially be done through trade tools. And nobody talks about developing the designs of this. I mean, Paris is nice, but and it's good for the private sector and because a lot of private investment goes into, climate change technology, but on the trade side, we still have to do the homework. And I think the WTO would be a wonderful intellectual center with all the people in Geneva to take this up and start talking about these concepts the way we started to talk at the beginning of the Uruguay round. That we had a lot of seminars how to tackle things, just think about putting together GATS. That was intellectual work, and I think that's what we should try to get. And I think climate change is a call we have to take up.
Just on that, to add on that point, it's not just to have seminars and have conversations like this, but it's important to go to the people and to try to convince them. Because if you offer a regular set-up meeting with NGOs, you know all the NGOs which are coming, and you know all the arguments, and they will stick to their arguments as you stick to what you are telling them. So what is essential is that you try to go to the town halls, that you try what we have done in Germany, you try to convince people that it's not bad about TTIP, that it's not bad about CETA, but we can make progress by them. And you have to show to the people that we have many small and medium-sized enterprises successful exporting. And they are exporting because we have the open market, but nobody realizes it. However, when something at home goes wrong, it's always done by the central government or by WTO or by some failures of trade. And that is easy said. And then people believe it. And it's so hard to convince them and show that in reality the story is the other way around. Thank you.
First of all, I fully second what Walter is saying here. These civil society dialogues have to be conducted by national politicians. In the European Union, whether we like it or not, there is not yet a European demos. There is no European demos. Mr. Juncker can say what he wants. Mrs. Merkel is much more credible in Germany than he is. And that is why I think what happened on the 19th of September in Germany in the SPD was very courageous and extremely useful. They had a very long debate on CETA, a very long debate, 5 hours on CETA in the party, and in the end, 2/3 voted in favor. Now, that is indeed something that I believe we should draw inspiration from. Second point, with all the sympathy I have for the climate change, what we have to watch out for is that we use the WTO, which is a good, sturdy workhorse, for things it hasn't been made for. There is no World Environmental Organization. That is the first best. It doesn't exist. Apparently it won't be created. But then you cannot use the WTO to do all sorts of things with regard to climate change. You need horses for courses. And the WTO can do all sorts of good things, but it can never be the champion of the environmental cause. Then you're going to put yourself up for major disappointment. Third, on this question of citizens, foreign investors, democracy, and whatnot, I must admit that I'm at a loss. Until the Lisbon Treaty, the European Union had no competence on investment. None. And it's only after the Lisbon Treaty that the European Union got into investment protection. Before the Lisbon Treaty, 1,000 bilateral investment treaties have been concluded by individual member states. Germany alone, 100. In all of them, you have investment protection. Are you then saying that Germany was not putting its citizens first? We are now trying, through what we have done in CETA, to have a massive change to this traditional model, but by working on ISDS and improving it, some NGOs still say, you are wrong. You are wrong because you are still allowing investors to use a court system other than the domestic one. I have full sympathy for the intellectual proposition. South Africa, Brazil have never concluded, or South Africa is repealing, Brazil has never concluded any investment treaty. They say a foreign investor has to use the domestic system, not ISDS. But what I think is on the verge of intellectual dishonesty is to say what the European Union has done in CETA is bad because we've improved the system.
Let's take another round of questions. We have to be really brief here if we're going to get all these in. So please here, one back there, one here, one there.
It's Sean Donnan for the Financial Times. I think we could spend the next week in Florence arguing what caused Brexit or Donald Trump's rise, and that would be wonderful. Since it's such a lovely city, I think that there is so much mixed research out there in terms of causation stuff. Even the David Otter stuff is, he himself says the 2.5 million jobs that were lost to China is roughly equivalent to a month's churn in the U.S. labor force, which is not, it's not a huge amount in the whole U.S. context. What he does say is that there are certain communities that were affected in an outsized way, and that's the lesson of the China shock. But I think that the whole point is that right now the whole trade community is caught in a defensive narrative, and as someone who works in communications, that's a terrible place to be. And the reason you're there is that for more than a decade now, since the Doha round was launched, you have failed to deliver anything really meaningful, and that really consumers can look at and say, this has materially changed my life. And I think that is one of the things people talk about around the WTO in terms of the end of the single undertaking, or as an idea, is coming up with a smaller set of deliverable, almost continuous agreements, e-commerce, investment, and so on. And I think that's a path that's really worth exploring. And I think this is also what has happened with TTIP. It just dragged on for too long. And it's the same thing that is happening with the TPP in some ways. You have to find a way to deliver these things more quickly.
Thanks. Yes, please, Marian.
Thanks, given that Michael is here. I have one quick comment on communicating with citizens and one question on e-commerce. I attended before the Brexit vote an event organized by Sean, where there was a Brexit discussion, and one thing that struck me is how easily the experts discussing brushed aside the outcomes of simulation exercises on how bad a Brexit would be. These studies, simulation studies, were not considered credible. It was that they are biased. Experts who write these, they write them because they want to defend their own positions. I find the kind of evidence, the kind of information that Lucian showed us this morning on where are the localities, where are the regions, where are the firms that export, I think that's the kind of information that would be much closer to voters and to the citizen, and that we could use more actively when talking about trade and trade liberalization. A question on e-commerce. My impression is that the WTO in the past has found it hard to deal with topics that have an active interface with regulation. TBT, SPS, how do we labor standards, how do we relate to ISO, how do we relate to Codex. Now, e-commerce is prone with interactions with regulatory areas, intellectual property, regulation of e-payments, regulation of technology standards, and what about consumer protection of digital information? Why is there so much optimism that we can move forward at the WTO in this area, and how would the interface with these regulations be defined?
Good. Yes, this gentleman here, please.
Thank you. Oops. My name is Carl Hamilton, trade economist, but also politician in Sweden for many years, and now advisor to the Commissioner, Cecilia Malmström. My first point is, I'll be brief. My first point is that I don't think that one should look upon the inward-looking, nationalistic attitudes in the United States and Europe in the same way. Here in Europe, it is anti-immigration, anti-refugees, and that is why you see it is Germany and Austria, usually free trade countries, which are most against, while Southern Europe is in favor of TTIP because they hope to export agriculture products. And if you look upon what Europe trying and also having made several trade agreements with countries like the Ukraine and in the southeast, there is no opposition to that at all. But if they were going to send all their immigrants, all their citizens to Europe, to Western Europe, that would be a different thing. My second point is that I don't understand why you say that there need to be something in international trade law if you want to have this kind of social security net or labor market policies. I'm from Sweden, and we have had it in the Nordic countries, in the Netherlands, and in other places. For decades, there was no need for any international trade legislation. Just go ahead in the United States if you wish. I think it is the wish which is lacking rather than the possibilities. And I think that finally, I think it is important for me and my country and the Nordic countries and many others, we see the Brexit as something which will possibly fundamentally change the European Union. The rest European Union will be more protectionist, anti-market. United Kingdom is a pro-market economy country, which is also the Netherlands and the Nordic countries. We lose a very important ally. So the nature of the European Union after Brexit will be different, and that will also be in the area of trade and investment and so on. So don't mix up, finally, the United States situation and the motives there with the European situation. It is different. I'm not saying it's better here, not at all. I think it's worse.
So let's just take a quick response from the panel. Let me go this direction this time. Ambassador, perhaps you could start.
Very quickly, I agree 100% with what Carl Hamilton just said. Globalization has not, I repeat, has not hemmed in any considerable way the possibilities for countries to conduct social policies, to conduct educational policy. Look at Scandinavia. What matters is the efficiency of your public sector system and your unit labor costs. That is what matters. But saying that globalization is going to lead immediately to or inexorably to a sort of race against the bottom is, I think, not substantiated. Two, indeed, perhaps, TTIP, that was also why Mike Froman said what he said when he said we need to do this with one tank of gas. Perhaps these things you either have to do very quickly, but then, of course, you run into all sorts of problems of democracy, transparency, and whatnot, or it drags on, and it can take a long time. Mind you, one of the paradoxes right now is that TTIP is always seen, and rightly so, as a 21st century sort of template for FTAs. And I think that is also its potential, its delivery, in particular in the regulatory domain. But I can tell you that the real reason why right now TTIP is stuck are the 19th century issues. The 19th century issues, not the 21st.
Okay. So I think completely right, it's the 19th century, but it's still in the minds of people, and we have to work against that. That is first thing to do. And second thing, as we discussed, that's immigration policy. We are all facing a tremendous threat by immigration policy, and we can't change that because immigration won't go away. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to take responsible steps to integrate those people and to help those people in their own countries. However, at the same time, we make a mistake if we say we take just care of immigration policy, because at the same moment we have to work against unemployment different standards of living within our own country. Because if we lose this aspect on the own people, they will complain about, and we won't get anywhere on the refugees question. Thank you.
All the lawyers in the room who study the case law, like shrimps, turtles, seals, tuna 1 and 2, know that trade and the environment are inextricably linked, and you can't separate the two. I'm not arguing that it should become an organization of the environment, but to the extent that you use trade tools to achieve environmental goals, you are within the WTO. And the question is, how far can we take this in case law, and where is the point where we need negotiations? For example, the PPM question. We have a mega shift towards looking into the production methods rather than the physical characteristics. But that is only acceptable in the long run if this is linked to solid transfer of technology rules. Otherwise, people will not be able to accept. And that needs to be conceptualized and negotiated. And that's, I think, is what that has to be done in the WTO, because it is a trade issue. It's not an environmental issue. It's a trade issue. Secondly, on the Trade Act, this is a specific instrument in the European Union, not in the member states. I propose to make sure that we have an ex-ante conceptual debate on where we want to go in trade policy. And if you phrase this in terms of a regulation, you know that under the Protocol 2, also national parliaments then can address it, and they can argue whether, for example, and decide whether, for example, audio visual services should not be in the Trade Pact, should stay outside under the doctrine of subsidiarity. And I think we would be able to structure the debate more rather than having it now when you're fully engaged in negotiations with your trading partners. That was the point.
I'll just be quick. On Sean's good idea about faster, more tangible gains from trade. I think the challenge, and this was mentioned a little bit by Marc, but to draw that out a little more is, of course, the ability to do that is heading in the opposite direction from the procedural mechanisms we're putting in. It's also heading in the opposite direction to the expansion of the Trade Act in the US, which has a long list of objectives that need to be achieved in every trade negotiation in order to be compliant. A different way maybe to go, but perhaps to get at the same idea of making this faster, is having something where you negotiate frameworks that have an easier opportunity to amend them moving forward, whether this is the idea that Werner and Charles or Chuck are putting out there on experimental approaches to this, or what Petros and I have recently done. There are different models that people are looking at, but that might be a different way to go. Because even beyond the process and Trade Act concerns, you do need linkage, right? The fewer issues you have, the more likely you're going to run into political opposition in some district that has a reason not to do that. So the reason why people have so many issues is in part to build that coalition of support.
Thank you. Let me utter the 5 most horrid words in any WTO meeting, which is, let me be brief. And summarizing, in part because drinks are going to be waiting on the outside, but I would like to pull together a couple of common themes that come out of this discussion. The first has to do with Thomas's launching the discussion on communications, and clearly vocabulary and linkage, I think, really matters. But Thomas Bolky also made the point that really evidence is not driving the discussion on trade policy per se. But I do think in the case of the US, at least, a political environment that I'm following quite closely these days, is this conflation of trade policy and immigration. And I think there's a little bit of that, as you guys mentioned, in the Brexit discussion. To the extent that we as a trade community can begin to drive a wedge between those two discussions and separate them out, both in policy terms as well as in practical terms, I think it would be very, very helpful. A second point has to do with the broader policy context. If we focus only on trade remedies or only on even trade adjustment assistance kinds of remedies, I think we'll be missing, at least in the United States, a very important point, which is this whole long-term driver of income inequality that we've seen. You mentioned the Anglo-Saxon countries. In fact, it occurred to me that these are the two sets of countries where finance capital has been really the dominant growth industry in a way, and I think that's driving the wage separation in the United States. But as long as we kind of ignore, as a trade policy community, what's happening to the median income of the country, which is clearly something that I think the forces for change in the political economy of the United States particularly will be missing a point. And here we've got to focus a lot on fiscal policy, something you mentioned, the social safety net, and then finally education. These are all not trade-related issues, but they're fundamental to the success of a progressive trade policy. The last point I take away from this is some degree of kind of optimism about the WTO and kind of the role of multilateralism. Of course, it would be terrific. It would be absolutely terrific if we got some agreement on fisheries and e-commerce. That would be a huge step forward, as well as realizing fully the trade facilitation agreement. Secondly, I think your sort of fundamental source of optimism that RTAs are in fact a stepping stone. They're not a stumbling block. They're stepping stones to a multilateral agreement. Well, if regional trade agreements are a stepping stone, I think one thing we have to begin to focus on is that whole discussion Richard Baldwin had a while ago about multilateralizing regional trade agreements. I think we should come back to that and propel it forward to the extent we can. And the final issue there is the issue of subsidies and trade environment. Subsidies, on the one hand, are really important issues. We're seeing that in the regional agreements. You're finding competitive spillovers and investment incentive policies, something Beata addressed this morning a little bit, but I think that's going to be increasingly an important issue in regional agreements. But it's best dealt with at the international level because the big subsidizers are the big countries that can only be disciplined through the multilateral region. And then finally, climate change. You know, we do have some people in Geneva that are thinking seriously about trade and climate change. I mentioned Richard Baldwin, that's one. Jim DeMello has been doing work in this area as well. I think these are really very important issues viewed from a long term, and maybe during this period of hiatus in multilateral and progressive multilateral policies, when we're not getting much action, maybe moving the WTO Secretariat, UNCTAD, the World Bank, into some of these other areas more systematically to lay the intellectual foundation in the vague hope that eventually, contrary to the current situation, as Tom tells us now, that evidence does matter, eventually evidence will matter. And I think doing that kind of research at the ITC and other places I think will be really important. So on that note, let me thank the panel and ask you to join me in thanking them.